Right. So far, we know that Despero came back from the dead because in the last couple of chapters, he comes back, he has no tail, he's covered in white flour. He goes to see the Mouse Council and demands an apology. And who's the only one to apologize? His father. His father sees him, he thinks he's a ghost, and he cries and he's hysterical. Oh, please forgive me, son. All that nonsense. And Despero says, in order to save himself, not to save his father. So his father is hysterical crying, and for the first time, Despero didn't think of his father. He thought of himself, and he said, I forgive you. Not to help his father, not because he actually forgives his father, but to stop his own heart from breaking from watching his father cry, which I think is pretty reasonable. Then he goes over to the king, because he knows that he cannot get to this princess alone. He needs someone much bigger. So he goes to the king, and he says, hey, I need your help. I know where the princess is. The king dismisses him. You don't know anything. I sent my guys down there. All of them went down into the dungeon. They couldn't find her. And Despero says, but think about it. Nobody can find their way out of the dungeon. You purposely made it a maze, so they probably didn't look everywhere. King doesn't care about him. He says, you're just like a rat. I don't need your help. And the king continues to cry. So Despero decides, I will be doing it on my own. I will be the knight in shining armor. Maybe and he remembers his dream. Maybe it's that I am supposed to be the knight and I am supposed to help the princess. So now he starts a plan in his head and we're going to figure out what he's going to do. He's going to the Threadmaster for some reason. Chapter 42. The Rest of the Thread. The Threadmaster was sitting atop his spool of thread, swinging his tail back and forth and eating a piece of celery. Well, look here, he said when he saw Despero. Would you just look at that? It's the mouse who loved a human princess back from the dungeon in one piece. The old Threadmaster would say that I didn't do my job well. That's because you're still alive. But I must have tied the thread incorrectly. But it's not so. And how do I know it? Because the thread is still around your neck. He nodded and took a bite of celery. I need the rest of it, said Despero. The rest of what, your neck? The rest of the thread. Well, I can't just hand it over to any old mouse, said the Threadmaster. They say red thread is special, sacred, though I myself have spent so much time with it, know it for what it is. What is it? Thread, said the Threadmaster. He shrugged and took another bite of celery. Nothing more, nothing less. But I pretend, friend, you see, I pretend. And what, may I ask, do you intend to do with the thread? Save the princess. Ah, yes, the princess. The beautiful princess. That's how this whole story started, isn't it? I have to save her. There's no one but me to do it. It seems to be that way with most things. No one to do the really disagreeable jobs except oneself. And how exactly will you use a spool of thread to save a princess? A rat has taken her and hidden her in the dungeon, so I have to go back into the dungeon, and it's full of twists and turns and hidden chambers. Like a maze, said the Threadmaster. Yes, like a maze. And I have to find my way to her wherever she is hidden, and then I have to lead her back out again. The only way to do that is with a thread. Gregory the jailer tied a rope around his ankles so that he would not get lost. And as the mouse said this, he shuddered, thinking of Gregory and his broken rope, dying lost in the darkness. I, said Despero, I will use thread. The Threadmaster nodded. I see, he said. He took a meditative bite of celery. You, friend, are on a quest. I don't know what that is, said Despero. You don't have to know. You just have to feel compelled to do the thing. It's impossible, important, and a task as at hand. Impossible, said Despero. Impossible, said the Threadmaster. Important, he sat chewing and staring somewhere past Despero, and then suddenly he leaped off his spool. Who am I to stand in the way of a quest, he said. Roll her away. I can have it? Yes, for your quest. Despero put his front paws up and touched the spool. He gave it an experimental push forward. Thank you, he said, looking into the eyes of the Threadmaster. I don't know your name. Hovis. Thank you, Hovis. There's something else, something that belongs with the thread. Hovis went to the corner and came back with a needle. You can use it for protection. Like a sword, said Despero. Like a knight would have. Yes, said Hovis. He gnawed off a length of the thread and used it to tie the needle around Despero's waist. Like so. Thank you, Hovis, said Despero. He put his right shoulder against the spool of thread and pushed it forward again. Wait, said Hovis. He stood up on his hind legs, put his paws on Despero's shoulders, and leaned in close to him. Despero smelled the sharp, clean scent of celery as the Threadmaster bent his head and took hold of the thread around Despero's neck and in his sharp teeth and pulled on it hard. There, said Hovis, when the piece of thread broke and dropped to the ground. Now you're free. You see, you're not going into the dungeon because you have to. You're going because you chose to. Yes, said Despero, because I'm on a quest. The word felt good and right in his mouth. Quest. Say it, reader, the word quest out loud. It's an extraordinary word, isn't it? So small, yet so full of wonder and hope. Goodbye, said Hovis as Despero pushed the spool of thread out of the threadmaster's hole. I have never known a mouse who has made it out of the dungeon only to go back in. Goodbye, friend. Goodbye, mouse among mice. Chapter 43. What Cook was stirring. That night, Despero rolled the thread from the threadmaster's lair along innumerable hallways and down 3 flights of stairs. Reader, allow me to put this into perspective for you. Your average mouse, or castle mouse if you will, weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 ounces. We did that in math. 4 pieces of bread. Despero, as you know, was in no way average. In fact, he was so incredibly small that he weighed about half of what the average mouse weighs. 2 ounces, 2 pieces of bread. That is all. Think about it. He was nothing but 2 ounces of mouse pushing a spool of thread that weighed almost as much as he did. Honestly, reader, what do you think the chances are of such a small mouse succeeding in that quest? 0. Nada. Zip. Goose eggs. But you must, when you are calculating the odds of a mouse's success, factor in love, especially love for a princess. Love, as we have already discussed, is powerful and wonderful. Ridiculous things capable of moving mountains, and spools of thread also. Even with the love and purpose of his heart, Despero was very, very tired when he reached the door to the castle kitchen at midnight. His paws were shaking and his muscles were jumping at the place where his tail should be throbbing, and he still had a very, very long way to go into the kitchen and down the many stairs of the dungeon and then somehow through the rat-filled darkness of the dungeon itself, not knowing where he was going. And, oh, reader, when he stopped to consider what lay ahead of him, he was filled with an icky feeling of despair. He leaned his head against a spool of thread, and he smelled the celery there, and he thought of Hovis and how Hovis seemed to believe in him and his quest. So the mouse raised his head and squared his shoulders, and he pushed up the spool of thread forward again, into the kitchen where he saw, too late, that there was a light burning. Despero froze. The cook was in the kitchen. She was bent over the stove. She was stirring something. Was it sauce? No. Stew? No. What the cook was stirring was soup. Soup, reader. In the king's own castle, against the king's laws, right under the king's very nose. The cook was making soup, and the mouse looked on. As the mouse looked on, the cook put her face into the steam rising from the pot and took a deep breath. She smiled, and the steam rose around her and caught the light of the candle and made a halo over her head. Despero knew how Cook felt about mice in her kitchen. He remembered quite clearly the instructions to Midge regarding himself. Kill him. The only thing a mouse is good... Ooh, wow. The only good mouse is a dead mouse. But he had to go through Cook's kitchen to get to the dungeon door, and he had no time to waste. Soon daylight would dawn, and the whole castle would be awake, and a mouse would have no chance at all of pushing a spool of thread across the floor without attracting a great deal of attention. He would have to sneak past the mouse-hating cook now. And so, screwing his courage into its sticking place, Despero leaned against the spool of thread and set it rolling on the floor. Cook turned from the stove, dripping spoon in her hand and a frightened look on her face, and shouted, "Who's there?" Chapter 44. Whose ears are those? "Who's there?" shouted Cook again. Despero wisely said nothing. The kitchen was silent. "Huh," said Cook. Nothing at all, just my nervous Nelly ears playing tricks on me. "You're just an old fool," she said to herself as she turned back to the stove. "Just an old fool afraid of being caught making soup." Despero slumped against the spool of thread, and as he leaned there, his heart pounding, his paws shaking, and a small wonderful idea occurred. A midnight breeze entered the kitchen and danced over the stove and picked up the scent of soup, and then swirled it across the floor and delivered the smell directly to Despero's nose. Despero put his head in the air. He sniffed and sniffed some more. He had never in his life smelled anything so lovely and so inspiring. With each sniff he took, he felt himself growing stronger and braver. The cook leaned close to the kettle and put the spoon in and took the spoon out and blew upon the spoon, and then brought it to her lips and sipped and swallowed. She said. She took another sip. Missing something. More salt, maybe? She put the spoon down and took an enormous salt shaker and sprinkled it into the kettle. And Despereaux, feeling emboldened by the smell of the soup, again set to work pushing the spool of thread. Quickly, he said to himself, rolling the spool across the floor. Do it quickly. Don't think, just push. Cook whirled the salt shaker in her hand and shouted, Who goes there? Despereaux stopped pushing. He hid behind the spool of thread as Cook took the candle from the stove and held it up. She said. The candlelight came closer. What is this? The light came directly on Despereaux's big ears, sticking up from behind the spool of thread. Oh, said Cook, whose ears are those? And then the light from the candle shone full in Despereaux's face. A mouse, said Cook. A mouse in my kitchen. Despereaux closed his eyes and prepared for his death. He waited, reader, and waited. And then he heard the sound of laughter. He opened his eyes and looked at Cook. Oh, said Cook, for the first time in my life I'm glad to see a mouse in my kitchen. Why, she asked, why am I glad? Because a mouse is not a king's man here to punish me for making soup. That's why. Because a mouse is not a king's man to take me to the dungeon for owning a spoon. A mouse. I, Cook, am glad to see a mouse. Cook's face was red and her stomach was shaking. She said again, and not just any mouse. A mouse with a needle tied to his waist, a mouse with no tail. Ain't it lovely? She shook her head and wiped her eyes. Look, Mouse, these are extraordinary times, and because of that, we must have some peace between us. I will not ask you what you're doing in my kitchen, and you, in return, will tell no one what I am cooking. She turned then and went back to the stove and set down the candle and picked up a spoon again and put it in the pot and took it back out and tasted the soup, smacking her lips together. Not right, she said. Not quite right. Missing something still. Despereaux did not move. He could not move. He was paralyzed by fear. He sat on the kitchen floor. One small tear fell out of his eyes. He had expected Cook to kill him, and instead, she laughed at him, and he was surprised by how much more the laughter had hurt. The end. And those were our chapters. I'm excited to see what happens next. See you guys later.